Good morning, John Muchler here, pastor at the Ferndale Alliance Church, and today we're going to talk about the 4-minute mile, the 2-hour, sub 2-hour marathon, and raising the bar. Jesus is raising the bar. He's not giving us a new bar. He's not replacing the old bar. He's not changing the bar. He's taking the existing bar, the Old Testament commandments, the words in the law and the prophets, and he's going to raise that bar and radicalize those commandments. And that's what we want to look at today. And I want to emphasize how positively Jesus looked at the Old Testament. He overwhelmingly had such a high regard for it. You can't really miss it in our passage that we have been studying. I note 8 different distinct phrases in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 through 20, a really important transition passage in the Sermon on the Mount. 8 phrases that demonstrate his high regard of the Old Testament. He didn't come to change it or to compete against it or replace it or negate it. He came to support it. And so note those 8 phrases as you follow along in Matthew 5, verse 17 on. Here we go. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law. That's the first phrase. I'm not going to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but, and here's number 2, to fulfill them. Verse 18. For truly I tell you that until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter nor the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear. That's the third phrase. Will not disappear. It will not disappear. From the law will not by any means disappear. It's from the law until everything is, here's the fourth one, everything is accomplished. Going on to verse 19. Therefore, if anyone sets aside, there's number 5, don't set aside. Anyone sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others, accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever, and here's 6 and 7, practices and teaches. Whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses, that's number 8, surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. Jesus says that our righteousness, not his righteousness, not Jesus' righteousness, but our righteousness must surpass that of the Pharisees. So we should stop and ask, who in the world were the Pharisees? They were a very important religious group at the time of Jesus Christ. There were several important and separate religious groups that had different views about culture, politics, economics, particularly religions, but the Pharisees were considered the faithful ones. They were considered great examples of Jewish life and faith. The word itself, Pharisee, means to be separate, they kind of stood apart as being extra religious, but the word itself has changed its meaning over time. You don't want to be called a Pharisee today. That's considered a very negative word. He's a Pharisee. It conveys somebody who's very religious, but a phony, who's dour and sour and mean-spirited and probably a hypocrite, probably really doesn't practice what he preaches, but he's got a lot of religious noise to him. That's the meaning of a Pharisee today. That was not the understanding of a Pharisee during the time of Christ. A Pharisee stood for a virtuous, good, and highly religious person, not a bad person. They were respected because they kept their religious faith consistently, taught it well, and modeled it for others. They were role models that parents would say to their Jewish children, that's what I want you to be like. Isn't that interesting? With all due respect, today we would not use the word Pharisee, and it's hard to come up with a word that would convey this idea of a wise and godly and good person. With all due respects, it'd be like combining Mother Teresa and Billy Graham into one person that people would say, generally would say, that's a really good religious person. And unlike the Sadducees, that's another dominant religious group at the time. Unlike the Sadducees, and Sadducees were more upper class, they were more elite, they kind of hobnob with the Romans. They like Hellenization of their culture, that is, bringing foreign and outside influences in. Could we say they were much more liberal? They were less faithful to Jewish customs. They didn't believe very much of the Old Testament, just the first 5 books. They didn't believe in an afterlife, so I guess they focused much more on the here and now. They were different than the Pharisees. The Pharisees were the ones that people would look up to and say, that's who you should be like. They were the role models of serious Jewish people. Again, they were generally considered good. They were liked. They were pious, and they were faithful leaders of the people. And so when Jesus says that your righteousness must surpass that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, and note, he leaves out Sadducees. He doesn't include the Sadducees in this group of examples. You're not going to make it. And this puzzled both the Pharisees and the disciples, and especially angered the Pharisees. Look at Matthew chapter 23, when he really goes after the Pharisees, saying to them that outwardly you might keep the law, but inwardly you're a mess. You're very, very far from God. Let me attempt a sports metaphor here to help us to understand how the early listeners would hear this commandment. You got to be better than the Pharisees. It'd be like saying to a runner, you have to run a sub 2-hour marathon, or you have to run a sub 4-minute mile. And if you're a runner, you go, what are you talking about? I'm not even going to enter the race. And that might have been the same reaction that Jesus' disciples said when they would say phrases like, who can hear this? How can we listen to this? What can we do about this? Who could possibly live that high of a standard? Coming back to my running metaphor, I'm going to take a little trip down a beaten path here, or maybe not so beaten path. I was kind of curious about the 2-hour marathon. I know that they had been working on that, and the news slipped by me. They actually finally broke the 2-hour marathon record. This was kind of an artificial marathon. They took the fastest guy in the world. They created the best track they could possibly create, close to sea level. He ran there were 7 people in front of him running to create a wind break. They had a bicyclist next to him that was providing the nutrition that he needed to run this thing. They chose the best time of the day, and he came in, I think, about 10 seconds under 2 hours. Now, we've run the 4-minute mile for decades now, and in fact, even a number of high school students can now run the 4-minute mile. I went and looked up the numbers. I was just curious. The current record for the 4-minute mile is 3 minutes and 43 seconds, and that is for a man. The woman's record is 4:12. Again, 3:43 for the men, 4:12 for the women, and I'm going to really take a rabbit trail here. That's a 30-second difference. And by the way, that's the same for high school kids. There are a number of high school boys that have just gotten under 4 minutes. For the girls records in high school, it's about 30 seconds longer than that. That is an eternity in a race. Think about running your best man and your best woman runners. The woman will come in 30 seconds behind the man at this time. So what does that mean in light of the recent Supreme Court ruling about Title VII of the Civil Rights Act that calls for fair and equal treatment, non-discrimination based on sex, and sex is broadly defined to include people who are transgendered? Does that come in conflict with Title IX? Title IX guarantees equal opportunity for men and women in sports. So I'm just thinking out loud here, and I'm not judging this. I don't have an answer, so we'll see how this plays out. But consider this, that your fastest woman miler is 30 seconds behind the fastest man. So what happens if a man who has transgendered into a woman has the ability to run that 4-minute mile or faster? Does that then establish a new woman's record? And is that fair when you're trying to attract women into sports? And we want that. Is that going to discourage women from participating? We are a great country. I'm sure we will work this all out, but it does raise some interesting questions in terms of maybe Title VII perhaps now being in contradiction to Title IX in terms of fairness and inequality. Okay, we are back from our rabbit trail, and we're going to talk about Jesus' expectations, raising the bar. And he does, in fact, raise the bar quite a bit, but he raises it to a new level that we actually can fulfill and find freedom in. And he shows us this with 6 fantastic examples. Just 6 examples that he's going to show us where he takes an Old Testament commandment, he radicalizes it and shows us how we can fulfill the intent of the scriptures itself. But before we do that, I want to take one last look at what a Pharisee is. And there's a great story about the Pharisees and where Jesus is really going to knock the floor out from under the feet of the disciples as to how we should look at Pharisees. It's found in Luke chapter 18. One of my absolutely favorite stories, and one that's often really misunderstood by people who read the story with 21st century eyes. This is one of those stories we need to adopt the perspective of somebody who was hearing it for the first time back at the time of Christ. And again, remember, a Pharisee was somebody that was extremely highly regarded and respected. Again, a combination of a Mother Teresa and a Billy Graham combined into one super saint. Let's just call them, they were super saints in the most positive sense of the word. So Luke chapter 18 verse 9, Jesus says this: to some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else. We all know people like that. I wonder if we're people like that. This idea that we are better, somehow better because we are of a certain church, certain denomination, certain country, a certain ethnicity. Jesus is talking to us. Those that think that they're, to some that were confident, to some who were confident in their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, he told this parable. It's a story that he makes up. Here's the story. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector, and some of your translations call him a publican. A publican is a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself, separated himself, which is what the word Pharisee means. They always sort of saw themselves as separate and better. And he prayed this prayer. Here's his prayer to God. God, I thank you that I am not like other people. Robbers, evildoers, adulterers, even like this tax collector over here. I fast twice a week and I give 1/10 of all that I get. He's saying, I keep the law, I go above and beyond the law, and you can compare me to anybody in the neighborhood, in the community, and I am far above and better than everybody else. That's his prayer. Pretty cool, huh? Now, by the way, nobody would have disagreed with him. Yeah, you are those things, you know. You might be a little cocky to share them in a prayer, but yeah, that's who you are. Then it goes to the other guy, the tax collector, who stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but he beat his breast and he said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Now, at this point in the story, there's really nothing strange going on here. Nothing controversial. Now, we read it with 21st century eyes, highly suspicious of anybody who's extra religious. But in the time of Christ, the disciple would say, that's a nice story, Jesus. Yeah, the Pharisee has every right to thank God that he's in a better place before God. And the tax collector, we all hate tax collectors. They were crooks. Tax collectors were people that took advantage of their position and power to extort more money out of people than they were supposed to. They were not liked at all. And so the disciple would say, yeah, the Pharisee, he's a good guy, and he should feel good before God. And the tax collector, Not a good guy. And if Jesus had asked this parable as a question, who's more righteous, they'd all put their hand up and said the Pharisee. But here's the catch of the story. Jesus flips things around. And again, our 21st century ears and eyes don't quite pick that up. Listen to what Jesus says. I tell you that this man, the man who says, I'm a sinner, can't even look up to heaven, rather than the other, the Pharisee, went home justified, pleasing, right with God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. This kind of goes back to the first beatitude, doesn't it? The very first one we looked at in chapter 5, verse 3. Blessed are the poor in spirit. That's the place where we start, of humility and brokenness. And when we look at ourselves and compare ourselves with other people, which is what the Pharisees did, we might come out looking okay. But when we look at the bar, which is Christ, we come out pretty short. One interesting grammatical comment about our passage: when the sinner, the tax collector, the outcast, the lowly guy says, be merciful to me, the language actually says, be merciful to me, not a sinner, but be merciful to me, the sinner. There's a definite article, the, in there, which is, I think, kind of interesting. It reads kind of clumsy. Be merciful to me, the sinner. But I think there's something important being said there. He's looking at the entire landscape of people around him, and he says, I'm at the bottom. This is much like Paul, right? When he says, I'm the chief of the sinners. Paul the Pharisee, who kept all the law, he said he kept the law, but he says, I am the chief of sinners. It's a fresh perspective on ourselves of realizing that before God, before Christ, who was perfect, that we have fallen very, very, very short. And regardless of where the bar is, we're going to fall short of that bar, and that's the right place to be. So let's wrap things up here. It's sort of like there's a double bar. There's the bar of the commandments in the Old Testament that Jesus is going to radicalize coming up here and tell us that's our standard. But there's also the bar of the Pharisees, when Jesus says you've got to surpass the righteousness of the Pharisee. Well, Jesus gives us the answer, gives us 6 examples we're going to study coming up here. They're in the second half of Matthew chapter 5, beginning at verse 21. I'd like to invite you to read those examples. Note that there are 6 of them, and it's very much a formula. Jesus says, you've heard it was written, and he quotes word for word an Old Testament commandment. But then Jesus says, but I say to you. Then he radicalizes the commandment. Again, he doesn't overturn them, negate them, contradict, abolish, or dismiss the Old Testament. He radicalizes it to a new place of freedom and liberty, I'm going to suggest. We'll get to that soon. Again, I hope that you'll read that, and we'll look at it next time together. Thank you for watching today.